Good morning, everybody. Hello, good morning. If everyone could grab a seat. Folks in the back, come on and grab your seat there. So, good morning. My name's Glen MacDonald. I'm the president of the American Association of Geographers, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all then to the speech this morning by our honorary geographer, James Hansen. And this will be not just a talk about, James' vision and his priorities and his views and experience in terms of climate change and averting the next global climate change catastrophe. But it's going to also be a dialogue. It's a conversation that's going to allow you to have a chance to converse with James. So there'll be a presentation by James, and then there will be a dialogue, and I will moderate that dialogue, and I have a few questions I want to sneak in there as well, but you will get a chance to ask your questions then. And so, I'll be running around the room like Jerry Springer and selecting people to speak and ask questions from James. And then following that, we will have a presentation, because you get to not only come here and work to be the honorary geographer, but we do give you a memento of that. Now, for me in particular, I work on long-term trends of climate change and environmental impacts of these trends and societal impacts. So to have an honorary geographer this year, James Hansen, who really is globally one of the seminal figures in climate change research and in alerting society and thinking about solutions going forward to the climate change challenges we face. To me, it is just an unbelievable pleasure and an honor to have James Hansen be the honorary geographer during my term as president. James started out as an astronomer and a physicist at the University of Iowa, and he then learned from James Van Allen, very, very distinguished, renowned astronomer. And James' early work was on Venus and was on the atmosphere and conditions on Venus. But James had a very, very far-ranging mind. He went to then NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, GISS, in New York City, and he rose to be the head of GISS from 1981 to 2013. During his time there, starting in the early 1980s, he understood that we could put together records from all the various dispersed meteorological stations, this network of meteorological stations that we have, some of which give us records back to the 1850s. And by mathematically and statistically working with them, we could begin to get hemispheric and global averages of what was happening with the Earth's temperature. And those could be then compared, for example, to what we were then getting out from Charlie Kennel's measurements of increasing CO2, and later on with the ice core measurements of CO2. And from there, then, we have this tremendous longitudinal record that every year we see the GISS climate change record. We look at hemispheric patterns, we look at global patterns of temperature change, for example, and that has become one of the most persuasive instruments we have in terms of providing facts and evidence about climate change. I think a seminal moment came in the United States and globally for climate change research with the June 1988 testimony to the U.S. Senate, which James Hansen provided, which really focused our attention on what was happening and the implications that this had, not just for our country, but globally, not just environmentally, but socially and economically. And from there, James continued to stand at the lead of climate change efforts while the head of NASA and GISS. And during part of that time, of course, there were political differences during the Bush administration, and he might give us some insights on how we deal with that today. And at 2013, then, after he left his position there, he became an adjunct professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University, and has been still a leading intellectual, freer still to speak his mind and produce his ideas on climate change, and has remained at the forefront of national and international efforts to confront realistically the challenges that we face with climate change. His recognition for his work has been manifest. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's won the Dan David Award, the Hansen Award, the Carl Rousby Medal from the American Meteorological Association, and Time Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in one of its issues. He doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. If you Google, you'll find a picture of James being arrested at a protest in Washington. So he's out there with the best of the activist geographers. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Hansen.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'm glad to see there are so many geographers. I was very dismayed a few decades ago when Columbia University eliminated its geography department, and I argued against it, but it seems you survived very well without Columbia University. Okay, so the answer to this question, can the next generation avert a catastrophe, is yes, provided that, but only if young people understand their political power and use it wisely. So let me explain what I mean by that. You know, unfortunately, I'm not a preacher. I don't have the skills that my friend Steve Schneider did in discussing this topic. I was described by Robert Poole as a witness. And some of my colleagues describe my style as blurting out the truth, which invariably gets me in trouble with the government and the bureaucracy. And you know, what I want to talk about today is being a witness to more than the climate change. You know, I was born before the United States entered World War II. So I've been a witness for the last 3/4 of a century. And the point I want to make about that is the climate change problem cannot be fixed without fixing some government problems with our government. You know, things, I'll explain this in a few minutes. Things went very well for 1/4 of a century or so, but from the late 1960s onward, there's been a deterioration in our governments, and I'll talk about that. But let me first mention our first paper on this topic in 1981 was published in Science magazine. I actually submitted this paper 4 times, 3 times to Science and once to Nature, and each time it would get rejected because it was way too long. And I would reduce it 20%. They'd send me the rules, which were for very short papers, but I would reduce it 20% and send it back. And eventually it was published. It was 10 full pages in Science magazine. The point I wanted to make here was, well, this paper was sort of my original sin in the sense I sent it to Walter Sullivan, who was the science writer for the New York Times. I sent it to him a week before it was published. And he wrote an article on the front page of the New York Times, which then got me in trouble with, and I ended up losing, we're getting $230,000 a year. But the CO2 climate program was turned over to the Department of Energy, and they didn't like this paper. So we got cut to 0, which was pretty difficult for us at that point. But it was actually a pretty insightful paper, I think, as the things that were mentioned in our abstract have actually turned out to be accurate predictions. Now, and you know, in 1982, Taro Takahashi and I organized a symposium, a Ewing symposium at Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory in Palisades, New York, which was sponsored by ExxonMobil Research and Engineering. And the dinner speaker was the president of ExxonMobil Research and Engineering, who gave a very insightful talk. He said the difficulty with this climate problem is the delayed response of the system, which is potentially very dangerous because he said if you don't have anticipation, you can lose control of the system. So this was a very insightful analysis by the president of ExxonMobil Research and Engineering. But then if the anticipation that he talked about should have been, well, in that case, we had better start working on some energy sources that don't produce CO2. But instead, and this was not the president of the parent company. Instead, they doubled down on fossil fuels by beginning a major multi-billion-dollar research program in how to extract more fossil fuels from the ground. And it took them a few decades, but they were very successful in developing the fracking technology, which allows them to get more oil out of shale and more gas out of the ground. But unfortunately, that's not the right anticipation that we needed. Well, anyway, that paper in 1981 led to several requests to testify to Congress during the 1980s. And as was mentioned, the 1988 testimony got a lot of attention, and not all of it positive attention. Some of my colleagues did not appreciate what I said, but it's kind of interesting in the comments made in this story written by Richard Kerr in Science magazine. It exposes something that I call scientific reticence. For example, there's a statement by one of the scientists that said, if there were a secret ballot at the meeting on the question, most people would say the greenhouse warming is probably there. And then another one said, what bothers a lot of us is that we have a scientist telling Congress things we are reluctant to say ourselves. Because, you know, the situation, I think, became pretty clear and continues the same today, but it's just not recognized by the public that we have a crisis. And it's caused by the fact that the climate system has so much inertia. The ocean is 4 kilometers deep on average, and the ice sheets are a few kilometers thick, so they don't respond quickly as we apply forces. And that means there's both more warming that's in the pipeline without any additional changes in the atmospheric composition, but there's also slow impacts that are going to build up without any additional forcing. And our climate system is dominated by amplifying feedbacks. It didn't have to be that way, but that's the way it is, and this is proven very conclusively by the Earth's history, where we see how sensitive the climate system is to given forcing. One example is this, what did I do here? I want to show this. Yeah, the big issue is the sea level and the stability of ice sheets. What I would like to do is, I can't seem to do that. Well, I was going to show a 11-second movie where the ice shelf, a part of it just collapses. Now that recently some of the modelers of ice sheets have put into their models the processes of hydrofracturing and cliff failure, which in effect says ice sheets are not made of stone. They can collapse relatively rapidly. And if we go down the path of business as usual the rest of this century, the forcing on the ice sheets would be so great that it's hard to imagine them surviving that kind of forcing without rapid changes. And already, over the last century or so, the rate of sea level rise has increased by an order of magnitude. It's still at a rate of 3.4 millimeters a year, is a little more than a foot a century. But if we continue with business as usual, that rate is going to continue to ratchet up, and we'll be talking about meters of sea level rise in a century. And we know from the Earth's history, the last time it was warmer than today, already our temperature today has risen out of the range of the Holocene, the present interglacial period, and is into the range of the Eemian, the prior interglacial 120,000 years ago, when sea level reached heights of 6 to 9 meters, that's 20 to 30 feet higher than today. So that's what we could anticipate if we even begin to slow down emissions now and keep the warming at 1.5 or 2 degrees. Eventually, you would expect sea level rise of several meters. So, and the issue is how long will that take? And in this paper we published last year, we conclude that if we stay on continued high emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels, that we will get multimeter sea level rise on timescale of 50 to 150 years. And that, the implication of that, more than half of the world's largest cities are on coastlines. So if we allow the ice sheets to go unstable, those coastal cities will become dysfunctional, and the economic implications of that would be incalculable, and the number of refugees would dwarf anything by orders of magnitude than what we've witnessed recently. So we really can't let that happen. And the potential injustice of that is particularly toward young people and their children and grandchildren. But also there's a north to south injustice in that, let me mention that the climate effects at low latitudes are actually greater than at the high latitudes. And one way we can see that is to look at this bell curve that describes the distribution of seasonal mean temperature anomalies about the average of taking the climate of last century as being a standard for comparison. The natural variability forms a nice bell curve, but what's happening to the seasonal mean temperature is that bell curve is shifting. And the main effect of that is the increase in the number of extreme warm events, which used to occur less than 1% of the time, and now more than 10% of the time. But this depends upon where you are, and it depends upon the season. So in the United States, the shift of the bell curve is about 1 standard deviation in the summer, which is perhaps noticeable if you're old enough to remember the climate of 50 years ago. Summers are tending to have some more extreme summers, but the shift in the winter is not very large because the variability is greater in the winter. And this is measured in standard deviations relative to the normal. But in places like the Middle East and the Mediterranean region, the shift in the summer is more than 2 standard deviations, so every summer is warmer than it was 50 years ago. And the most extreme are several standard deviations. And in the tropics, all 4 seasons have a shift of about 2 standard deviations. And this is a noticeable effect there because it was already hot in the tropics and in the subtropics in the summer. So, well, actually globally, there are effects that are obvious most places where we can see statistically that the increased heating, the higher temperatures do lead to more extreme droughts at the times and places when it's dry, and more extreme forest fires. But also because the atmosphere holds more water vapor, when you do get rain, you get greater rain and stronger floods. So the 100-year flood is now occurring more than once a century. But at these lower latitudes, it's becoming less livable outdoors. And in the summer, in the subtropics, and all seasons in the tropics. And most of the jobs, more than half of the jobs, are either agricultural or construction, which is outdoors. So it is beginning to affect productivity at these places. And even there's a statistical effect on conflicts and violence, which seems to increase with increasing temperatures. There are effects at our middle latitudes also. We see, for example, that disease vectors, ticks and mosquitoes, their range is becoming larger and moving to higher latitudes and higher altitudes. So there are global effects. Now, the second injustice is, or the third on my list actually, is humans to all of the species on the planet, because we're causing the changes, and other species are being affected by it. It's the combination of rapidly shifting climate zones with all the other stresses that we're putting on species by taking over the planet that threatens to potentially cause the extinction of a significant fraction of species on the planet. And for example, the coral reefs, which are the rainforest of the ocean and harbor more than 1 million species, are being threatened by the warming of the ocean, by the acidification of the ocean from the added CO2, and other things other stresses that we're putting on coral reefs. And we're losing more than 1% of coral reefs each year. So it's another reason why we need to actually get CO2 to peak and actually come down. If we're going to keep shorelines where they are now, we're going to actually have to decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then if we do that, we would actually solve these problems such as the coral reef problem. But the difficulty is that we've only burned a small fraction of the fossil fuels, the purple part of the conventional oil, gas, and coal. the existing reserves is more than enough to cause many meters of sea level rise. So this was actually mentioned in our 1981 paper that we said, oh, you'd create a different planet with different shorelines if you burned all the fossil fuels. So we argued in that paper that you've got to phase out coal use. And it doesn't make sense to develop unconventional fossil fuels because we can't put that CO2 in the atmosphere and leave young people a situation that's not out of their control. So, but what's actually happening is, so what we would need to do is get this fossil fuel annual emissions to decline rapidly. Instead, it has kind of leveled out a bit in the last few years due to Chinese economy slowing down and due to the increase in renewable energy use. But it's not in the process of declining rapidly, which is what we need to have happen if we want to stabilize climate. So the fundamental problem is that we will keep burning these fossil fuels as long as they seem to be the cheapest energy to the public. They're not really the cheapest, but they are not made to include their cost to society. So the effects of fossil fuels on air pollution and water pollution and their effect on climate change are not included in the price of the fossil fuels. So what we should do is put a rising price on carbon. And some regulations are also required and technology development, but the fundamental underlying policy that's needed is to have a carbon fee, which I argue should be collected from fossil fuel companies at the source, the domestic mines or ports of entry. So it's very simple to collect. And but then what we do with the money is also crucial. I argue that we should give the money to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents, so that the person who does better than average in limiting their carbon footprint would make money. In fact, with the present distribution of energy use, 70% of the people would come out ahead. But if they want to stay on the positive side, they have to pay attention, which is pretty easy to do. You just look at the price of things on the shelf. Those things that use more fossil fuels will become more expensive. So it's, and this approach, economists agree, would stimulate the economy. And it provides the guidance to businesses and entrepreneurs to develop the products that are needed for us to move to clean energies. It's also the only, in my opinion, the only viable international approach, because if the United States would have a rising carbon fee, we could also place border duty on products from countries that don't have an equivalent carbon fee, and that would be an enormous incentive for that other countries to have their own carbon fee so they can collect the money themselves, rather than have us collect it at the border. And economists agree that that would work. In fact, there's now, just recently, there's been a group of conservative thought leaders, including 2 past secretaries of state and 3 secretaries of the Treasury, who have argued for exactly this fee and dividend approach. And they point out that the various advantages of that, including the reduced need for regulations, the market would help move you in the direction of phasing out fossil fuels and would allow shrinking the size of government because of the less need for regulations. And there's an organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, which has taken as its sole objective this fee and dividend approach and persuading our government to adopt this approach. Their approach is to write letters to the editor and op-eds and to visit their congresspeople, and they're very polite. They're using the democratic process. There's now more than 50,000 members of this organization, and more than 300 chapters in the United States. So I think this has a potential of moving the system in the right direction. And there's another way that we can put pressure on the system to in our democratic form of government, and that's 21 young people and I have filed a lawsuit against the federal government for violating the constitutional rights of young people and future generations. This is presently the case, the trial. The federal government requested that the case be dismissed, and that request was heard several months ago in the United States District Court in Oregon, and the judges ruled against the federal government. So it will go to trial probably this November, and I'm quite sure we will win, given the judges' comments during these proceedings. I'm quite sure we will win this case at the district court level, and it will get, no doubt, appealed to the Supreme Court. But where this refers to the paper that provides a scientific basis for our lawsuit against the government, which this paper has been under review for several months, but I think it's close to being accepted by Earth System Dynamics. But it provides a scientific basis for our request that the government require policies that would reduce emissions several percent per year. And actually, it's strange that Secretary of State John Kerry several months ago proposed at the meeting of the parties in Morocco last fall, proposed a plan for the United States to reduce emissions 80% by 2050. Well, that's equivalent to a 5% per year exponential reduction, which is approximately what we ask in our case. We showed that if you wanted to stabilize climate by the end of the century, you should reduce emissions 6% a year. But 5% is close enough, so I tried to get the federal government to settle the case with us, because if they had done that, the Obama administration had settled, then that would have constrained later administrations, so that if they proposed things like approving a Keystone pipeline or reopening coal mines, which would be inconsistent with 5% a year reduction in emissions, then it would be possible to affect those actions. But unfortunately, we couldn't get the Obama administration to accept the settlement. So it will go to trial. And I think even with the conservative Supreme Court, the connection of this to the most fundamental principles of our government and the equal rights for all people, including young people, which are identified in the Constitution, equal protection of the laws, and no one is can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, the Fifth Amendment. I think that there's that we could even win this with a more conservative Supreme Court. But this takes time. And furthermore, it's not enough to win the case, because the courts cannot impose the nature of a solution. All they can do is say you're violating the constitutional rights of these young people. And they can even require the government to report back to the courts as to what they're doing. But that they can't tell the executive branch and the Congress the nature of the solution. That's not the way our government works. So, therefore, young people have to actually understand what is needed, because otherwise we get these half-baked, ineffective solutions, which is what has been proposed by government so far. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol, for example, they have a cap-and-trade system, which is so ineffective that global emissions actually increased faster after the Kyoto Protocol than they did before. And that's, again, it's more convenient for special interests to have such a hokey system. The US Congress introduced a bill, Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade system, which didn't pass, but it was 3,000 pages long, with every lobbyist who could raise his arm got his paragraph stapled into the bill. That's not an effective system. You really need a very simple one-page carbon fee across the board and no exceptions if you want to phase down fossil fuels. And by the way, the federal government, whose lawyers did not seem very good to me, but they're joined by these interveners who have the best lawyers that money can buy. But nevertheless, I think they're going to lose the case. Now let me move to talking about this problem in a larger context of not just energy system, but global poverty and human health. And in particular, let's look at this, at the changes that have occurred in the period, in the age of science and reason, which succeeded the age of religion and myths. And although this was the thought leaders were more European, but in fact the explosion of the Enlightenment on the global scene was in the United States with the American Revolution and the Constitution in the late 1700s. With the concepts of freedom, equality, and individual rights, and toleration of diversity, which gave rise to a democratic, constitutional, republican form of government. This was the first example of that, and which was characterized by the rule of law with consent of the governed and characterized by checks and balances among the competing interests. And religion did not disappear because science does not provide the compassion and the structure for life that many people need. And by the way, the founders of the U.S. government recognized that it was the country they created was still in the that slavery was inconsistent with the concepts of the Enlightenment and the initial forms of the U.S. government, and that was resolved in the Great Civil War, which was the bloodiest war in history up to that point. And Lincoln, in his 3-minute Gettysburg Address, said that this was to resolve whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people whether that would survive. The next threat to this concept was World War II, with the Nazism and its cousins in Italy and Japan, and also Marxism in the Soviet Union. Again, the democracy's triumph in World War II, and this spirit of cooperation and lifting all boats and reducing poverty spread at the end of World War II, with Marshall Plan, with formation of the United Nations, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as I said, I was born in 1941, and this quarter of a century from then through, Truman fired MacArthur because the executive should be determining of foreign policies, not a general. And Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, and Kennedy was inspirational, in setting a goal to go to the moon and starting the Peace Corps, for example. So that was the direction we were headed for a quarter of a century. But what I will argue is that in the latter 50 years, there began to be a decay that set into the nature of our government. Not to say that that our form of government and its encouragement of freedom of thought and things. We see these technological advances and things, but at the same time, we see how things have changed. So I can, just for example, it's very different for young people today than when I was young. I grew up in poverty. My father was a tenant farmer who couldn't make it on a farm, so we moved to a small house to the edge of Denison, Iowa when I was 4 years old. And we still had an outhouse for several years. Eventually we got a septic tank, so we had a toilet in the basement, and we had one sink upstairs for nine people. And my parents got divorced when I was 10 years old or so, so my mother raised the last several children. So it was still the same situation when I was 18 years old. We had this one sink, and we had one toilet in the basement. But it was a different situation. I could go to college. I could save enough money just delivering newspapers and things, and to go to college. College was not expensive. And in graduate school, the government supported education. So the University of Iowa had 30 graduate fellowships because the government knew we needed. This was the after Sputnik. So the government knew that it should invest in education, and it did that. So when I got out of college, the PhD, I didn't owe the government any money. Now, kids can end up owing money equivalent to the mortgage on a house. And in fact, it's crazy. And this is because we've let the system slip. and we've let the special interests take over. The big banks have more influence on these loan policies than the students do. So that's one example. So anyway, I was lucky to be trained in physics under Professor Van Allen. And when I went to NASA as a 25-year-old postdoc, I proposed a few years after getting there. There was a mission to Venus, Pioneer Venus, proposed by Richard Goody at Harvard and Don Hunton at Kitt Peak National Observatory in Arizona, an inexpensive spin-stabilized spacecraft to go look at the atmosphere of Venus. And I proposed this experiment, which was a 1.4-inch telescope, which took this image of Venus, of the veil of Venus that shrouds the planet, which turns out to be sulfuric acid cloud. But I sent the proposal directly to the evaluating group, failing to send it through the bureaucracy. And it got, which made bureaucracy somewhat angry, but because it was selected, they couldn't turn it down, so they just slapped my wrists. Well, then I proposed, a few years later, I sent an experiment, and again, I forgot to send it through the bureaucracy. I sent it straight to the selection group for an instrument on Galileo, mission to Jupiter, which was also selected. And then the bureaucracy went through the roof and made sure this would never happen again. They were not able to add their taxes onto the proposal. But what's happened is we have more and more a bureaucratic state. We also have the invisible state with invisible budget, which does things like make plans to overthrow governments but let me mention, so for example, let me pick on my favorite agency, which I still have a lot of respect and love for, but so and NASA is one of the better agencies. It's still ranked in the top, so it's ranked in terms of innovation. It's ranked 4th out of 300 federal agencies. But if you look at the budget, for example, of Goddard Space Flight Center is $5 billion a year. And compare that to the budget for the National Science Foundation, which is $7.7 billion a year. And NSF, scientists submitting a proposal in NSF, even if it gets an excellent grade, you've got like a 10% chance of getting funded. There's something completely out of whack, and the reason is the agencies like NASA can get their budget from their senator, rather than a competitive process. Finally, a few years ago, I submitted, there was this center director at this small NASA center in Mountain View, California. Pete Warden was kind of the maverick in NASA, and he wanted to have small satellites, inexpensive. So I got together with him, and we were proposing a small satellite to measure, $90 million satellite to measure aerosols in the Earth's atmosphere, which is a crucial measurement since the climate forcing is comparable to that by carbon dioxide, but of the opposite sign. And unfortunately, Pete let the director of Goddard know about the proposal. And so it got nixed because they saw it as competition to a $1.5 billion proposal by the big NASA center. So then that's when I decided to resign from NASA, and not long after, Pete Worden is also gone from NASA. But so it's a little exaggeration to describe these large centers as self-licking ice cream cones, but they're not actually far from that. And there needs to be a bipartisan outside review of how they need to be opened up to the private sector. And it takes, Elon Musk can launch to space hardware for 1/20th of what it costs NASA to launch it. So there's something wrong here, and we're not using our money in the most effect. Our government is not using the money, the taxpayers' money, in the most effective way. So, in any case, I'm probably taking too long. Let me quickly try to finish. So, during the Industrial Revolution, we rapidly increased our energy use and raised the standards of living via fossil fuels, which now the average person has the equivalent of 600 energy people or slaves, because energy is required to raise the standard of living. But unfortunately, and most of that is now from fossil fuels, and we can't continue that so we've got to figure out a way to phase down rapidly the role of fossil fuels. Amory Lovins was right in pointing out that the government projections for energy requirements did not need to continue to grow the way that they had been projected. But his vision that we would, by this point, be getting most of our energy from soft renewables is far off the base. We're getting about 10% of our energy from renewables, but that renewables is partly large hydro, and about half of it is from biofuels and wood, which is not carbon neutral. So we're only getting about 3% from truly renewable, soft renewables. And the real problem is that the U.S. is not the main issue for the future. It's the developing world, which is getting most of its energy from coal. I was going to show this 3-minute movie clip, but I'll just tell you what it says. It starts out with a lady saying, "We don't need nuclear energy. Give us the energies we have now. Give us coal, oil, but certainly not nuclear." And then the guy singing a song with 200,000 people swinging and swaying in agreement with him says, "Give me the warm glow of a wood fire." Well, so what you need to point out is that these fossil fuels that the older woman was pointing to, the pollution from them, just the air pollution from them, leaving out the water pollution, kills 3.5 million people per year, which is more than 10,000 people per day, which is more than have been killed by nuclear power in the history of nuclear power. And this indoor wood fire, the World Health Organization points out that estimates 3.7 million people die from indoor air pollution, which is, again, is more than 10,000 a year. So we have to have a rational assessment of the potential of different energy sources. And this is my oldest grandson, Connor, who is reading about urgent problem of Indiana Jones. But Connor actually pointed out correctly the two most fundamental facts. One of them is that unless young people can figure out how to make a time machine that actually works, there'll be no way for them to go back and fix the problem that we're causing them. And secondly, grown-ups are afraid of nuclear power, but what about the dangers of fossil fuels? We know that they're not safe. They're very dangerous for sure. Well, we make two mistakes, I think. We should, instead of renewable portfolio standards, we should have clean energy portfolio standards. But the real issue is we should not have turned off the research and development on nuclear power, which was terminated principally by Jimmy Carter and then Bill Clinton in his first State of the Union confirmed, that we didn't need nuclear power, so he's not going to support research and development. The thing is, we're using 50-year-old nuclear technology, which has actually been pretty safe, and there have been some accidents, but it's like with airplanes. If you have an accident with an airplane, you don't say, okay, we're not going to have any more airplanes. You figure out how to make that airplane safer. And it turns out then that airplanes are our safest form of travel. Well, there's tremendous potential in nuclear technology to do things much safer so that you can't, we know how to make reactors that can't melt down. They don't have fuel rods to melt down. So we should have, and we've constructed a system with our Nuclear Regulatory Commission which is designed to phase out nuclear power, make it so expensive that you can't build it. While in fact we should have developed the technology so we can make safe reactors in the factories so they would be inexpensive. So finally, let me go to a couple of final statements. I think that over the last 50 years that there's been this political decay that is threatening the future of young people. Our system still has allowed innovations and technological progress, but that's not enough. The fruits are concentrated too much in the hands of the few. We have become a land for the rich and the home of the bribe, in my opinion. Lobbyists for special interest in Washington dwarf the number of lawmakers, and all lawmakers are taking money from special interests. And the public understands this and is becoming increasingly frustrated with both parties. And this is not limited to the United States, by the way. I've gone to more than a dozen countries, and the fossil fuel industry has tremendous influence on all governments. The frustration of the public is what is giving rise, I think, to this populism in various countries. And the combination of this trend toward populism and climate change is very dangerous because the populist leaders all say, oh, climate change is a hoax, and encourage more fossil fuel use. So this is creating a really dangerous situation for young people. So I argue that it's crucial for the world that the United States resume the leadership role that it exhibited in the first quarter of the century, the quarter of a century from World War II and the following quarter of a century. And I think that this requires a third party, which I discuss in more clearly in this book that I'm writing now, Sophie's Planet. Um, I find that the truth is neither party really gives much of a damn about climate change. We persuaded Bernie Sanders to have a carbon fee and dividend. And what does he want? He wants 40% of the money because for social programs. But as soon as you do that, then the public will never let this carbon fee rise because most people will be losing money. The special interests, both parties are taking money from special interests. When Richard Gephardt retired from being the House leader a couple decades ago, in the first quarter he got $120,000 per quarter from Peabody Coal, which is $500,000 a year from one source. That's just the way that both parties work. And Hillary Clinton sees nothing wrong with taking $250,000 or $500,000 for a speech to the big banks. And then then the big banks end up screwing young people. I've complained about this White House censorship. When I try to testify to Congress, the Office of Management and Budget would change my testimony. And I thought, and that was during the Bush administration, but when Obama took over, he did not change this. Scientists working for federal agencies have to submit their testimony first to the White House for approval. And the public affairs offices are still staffed by political appointees and feel that their job is to make the president look good. This is true for both parties. And this, the bureaucratic state and invisible state thing, those continue. So I think we need a third party which is going to go back to the principles on which our government was founded and take no money from special interests. And young people could do that. Because look what happened with Obama overtook Hillary in the Iowa caucuses 8 years ago, 9 years ago, because of young people knocking on the doors in Iowa. And then Bernie Sanders almost got the nomination last year, again, because of young people supporting him. But when Obama was elected, young people didn't know what to ask, and they ended up with this Waxman-Markey ineffectual thing. So young people are going to have to understand what is needed and look out after their own rights. We still have a democracy in which it could work, but it's not enough to ask for, oh, please solve the problem. You actually have to look at what policies are proposed and implemented. Thanks.
James Hansen is our 2017 Honorary Geographer. We're very, very pleased then to, let's see, you need us to move this way maybe? To present you with a memento of that. It's a beautiful crystal, engraved crystal. I'll have to tell you, remembering what happened at the Academy Awards, I checked that to make sure that was the right award there, and it was indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that some of you must have some questions, so I'm gonna try to moderate this, and James will answer. You were first up with the question, so please go ahead.
So my question relates to the carbon tax.
Would you stand up, please, and then you have to really enunciate. Go ahead.
So my question relates to the carbon tax in particular. With having a president that really doesn't care about climate change or even the environment in general, and then the fact that we have a Secretary of State
You know, yeah. So the question is about carbon tax, and in particular whether our current president and Secretary of State Tillerson. You know, actually, I've got a video of Tillerson in 2009 in which he proposes, and he was then ExxonMobil CEO, and he proposed a carbon tax. But he said it's very hard for him to say those words, so he proposed instead the description as carbon fee. He didn't exactly say carbon fee and dividend, but he had a phrase that meant the same thing. And I thought, gee, did this guy propose this before I did? So I started looking back at when I had given talks, and I found that I had. Actually, I'd sent a letter to President-elect Obama in December of 2008, which I couldn't get John Holdren to deliver. So I put it on my website. But I proposed a carbon fee and dividend in 2008, so it was a year before Tillerson. But he actually understands, and frankly, most captains of industry, as I call them, understand this, that they say I talked with the CEOs of the 3 biggest utilities in the eastern half of the U.S., and all of them say the same thing. They want the government to give them the guidance, and they say the way to do that would be through a carbon fee or carbon tax. They would like to know what it's going to be like over the next years, and preferably even decades, and they would then make the investments to move electricity off of fossil fuels. But without that, their first obligation is to their stockholders to make money. And so if fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, they will keep using them. And you can try to force them via regulations, which is what Obama's doing. Obama did, but that accomplishes very little. There's actually closing of coal plants, but not because of regulations, but it's because gas is cheaper. And that's why utilities are shifting. So you need to use the market, but you have to make the price of fossil fuels honest. And I think that conservatives, true conservatives, as James Baker III and these George Shultz and things, they actually think this makes sense. This is the most sensible thing to do. Let the market help you make the decisions. And if you do that, that's when the economy is most efficient. We would be best off economically if the prices were honest. True conservatives know that. The Republicans who are against it are not doing it on the basis of conservative principles. They're bribed. They are on the payroll of the fossil fuel industry. When a guy throws a snowball in the Senate, it's because he's getting a huge amount of money from the fossil fuel industry. It's not because of anything about conservative principles.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question that kind of follows up on the one right before, and it has to do with the fact that, so it's going to take time to implement some sort of carbon fee and dividend program for all the reasons you just mentioned. But we also needed to peak emissions in 2015 and then rapidly decline to, say, under 2 degrees Celsius. And so if you titled the talk "The Next Generation Avert a Catastrophe," and you opened up by saying yes to the use of power, and I was wondering what you thought of the Keep It in the Ground movement as a way to kind of like fill in the gap until we can get a carbon tax. What can we be doing maybe on the ground to be blocking more infrastructure?
Well, so the question is, first, she made the comment that it's difficult, it will take time to get something like fee and dividend. And therefore, can you do some things more quickly to aid, for example, keeping the actions to try to keep fossil fuels in the ground? And of course, I have participated in those. As was mentioned, I've actually been arrested 5 times, mainly at twice for mountaintop removal, and twice for tar sands pipeline, where the idea was just what you were suggesting, namely try to stop the construction of this infrastructure, which would allow the exploitation of this very carbon-intensive source of fossil fuels. And so I think those kind of actions are useful, but they only, the way to stop tar sands from being exploited is actually, you know, then they started using a train to carry the stuff. So the way to do it is via carbon price, and I frankly think that's the fastest thing that we can do. We're actually close to that. If you know, if Ivanka or her husband would be persuaded of this, because they do seem to understand that climate change is real and might be able to convince President Trump. You know, it actually would make enormous amount of sense. When you have a carbon fee that's rising over time, that makes products made in China or some distant place disadvantaged because they've got this bigger carbon footprint to get it back here. So it favors returning some of the production to the United States, consistent with what the president claims he wants. So if we can just get some common sense, get them to understand some very simple things, and that was the whole idea of James Baker III, is to try to make them understand the merits of this, because it could happen quickly. And I should say this organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, has initiated within the House, has persuaded representatives to initiate something called the Climate Caucus, which has an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and they won't add people to it except in pairs, an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. And they're now, I think, 34 members, and their objective is this concept. So it could happen quite rapidly as the compromise between conservatives and liberals. You've got to get Bernie Sanders to understand he can't have the money, because if the money is taken by the government, it makes the government bigger, the public doesn't like the taxes going up, and it depresses the economy. But there's been an economic study that shows that if you had a carbon fee that rose to $100 a ton after 10 years, it would increase the GNP, create 3 million new jobs, and so it actually makes economic sense, and we could just get the politicians to do what's in the interest of the public, especially young people, then we could do something quickly. Yeah, the question is about divestment. You know, I at the request of Bill McKibben, you know, I've written letters supporting this divestment activity. This would be, relating to the last question, a very slow process, because the immediate effect of divesting is somebody else will buy that stock and get it at a slightly lower price. And it doesn't, you know, I don't want to discourage it, but it's, frankly, it's more symbolic than than consequential, in my opinion. But as I say, I don't want to discourage it. And it is, you can point to organizations like AGU and maybe AAG, if they're holding stocks of fossil fuel companies, I think it's appropriate to shame them, but that is not, that if you spending all your time on that sort of activity rather than the actions that would actually do something, I think that would be a mistake.
May I even, I actually am a member of the AAG Council, so I just will inform you that over a year ago, we began an analysis to look at socially responsible investing with the AAG portfolio. We have some $11 billion in an endowment. The money from that endowment subsidizes your membership fees. It subsidizes your registration for this thing. We make no money on this fee. So we began then the process of examining this. And I have to tell you, it's very, very difficult because our money is not in, let's say, equity like a coal company or something like that. It's in a bunch of mutual funds or bonds. So we had to bring in then an investment analyst to help us look at this issue. And he came forward and suggested there were two funds that we could safely move money into, a small part of our portfolio of bonds that have come due now, that were rated very highly as socially responsible investment. And we took the decision at the council meeting, this council meeting, just before the AAG meeting, to then take his advice and then to invest that money in those two mutual funds, which had been screened and were thought to be good. But it turns out it was really, really tricky business because you've got these mutual funds. Secondly, I will tell you that there were almost 20 different causes which members have told us not to invest in, including any corporation which contributed to Hillary Clinton's campaign. Any corporation which contributed to Donald Trump's campaign. So our membership are asking us to invest in almost anything or almost nothing, okay? So we are working on it, but believe me, it's not so simple. Let me take it from the back here now for James. Go ahead, sir. And speak loudly.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hansen. And I have to start by saying that your work is incredible and an incredible service to humanity, and I'm awestruck by it and extremely grateful for it. That said, I'm troubled by some of your comments regarding nuclear power, and in particular because, when you're talking about nuclear power, you're talking about an industry that has that routinely contaminates bodies and has contaminated whole landscapes with radiation, particularly in the developing world, or the global south, and in indigenous lands here in the Americas. You're talking about an industry that has, it's not just a couple, well, there were one or two small accidents. We're talking about Chernobyl, Fukushima, accidents that have spread and irradiated the globe with radiation, spread radiation, particularly, with Fukushima to Japan and the western U.S. And that has consequences down the generations. You're talking about wanting to safeguard our planet for future generations, for our children and grandchildren. Those radiation effects don't necessarily show up immediately. They have dire consequences for future generations. And so with the injustice to indigenous communities in the global south, with the injustice to labor from mining, from extracting radioactive materials, uranium and the like, and with the risks, with the fact that you're talking about R&D for an industry that can't construct a new plant for under $1 billion, and that's not going to get cheaper in the foreseeable future. With all of that, I would much rather see us having this conversation in the context of non-extractive, fully renewable resources like wind and sun and small hydro that do not carry those large risks to future generations.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand the popularity of standing up and saying, oh, we can do everything with the sun and wind. If you want to be popular, if you want the audience to clap, then that's what you say, and you can hobnob with Hollywood stars. The reality is that there is no energy source that is non-extractive, and there's no energy source that doesn't have consequences. And so you need to scientifically compare those and quantitatively compare those and look at the potential of doing things right. The radiation story is a particularly important one to look at. This is a story which will be in my book. There was a very good reason. I don't think it's a good scientific reason, but when Hermann Muller, when the United States and Soviet Union were testing nuclear weapons in the air and spreading nuclear radiation around the world, he declared that his evidence suggested that even the smallest level of radiation was harmful. And this was, in a sense, useful in that it made enough pressure that the United States and the Soviet Union stopped doing nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Now, when you actually look at the data, it doesn't support that assumption, a so-called linear, no-threshold assumption that any amount of radiation is harmful. In fact, there's at least comparable support for the concept that very low levels of radiation are beneficial to human health. And there's lots of empirical evidence one way or another. You know, people in Denver get less cancer than on average than other places in the United States. And then they say, well, but people in Denver ride horses more, so they have more healthy lifestyles. So anyway, it's a hard problem, but actually the evidence is coming out now pretty strong in favor of the concept that low levels of radiation are not harmful. They may even be beneficial. But the main point is you have to look at the pros and cons. You know, if we want energy, and if we're going to, we need energy, and so you compare the disadvantages that come with each energy form. And as I said, in one day, fossil fuels are killing more people than the history of nuclear power. And the potential of newer technologies to eliminate the problems, most of the problems of nuclear power are quite impressive. So it does not make sense to close down the R&D and leave yourself no alternative. Right now, for baseload electric power, the only alternatives are fossil fuels and nuclear power. But we've refused to improve the capabilities of nuclear power. So it's an emotional subject more than it is one of scientific analysis. I'm amazed. I get all these letters from people saying, essentially repeating what you just said. And I could write a long letter in response, but I don't know. I can't, in a few minutes, it's hard to respond to that, but I will do it in the book that I'm writing. I think that we have to be objective in looking at the different energy sources.
Take a question here. Sir. Hi. I saw your paper on negative emissions when it came out. I'm glad to hear that it's likely to be published. And the consequences of that paper were very disheartening to me. You know, we talk about getting, you know, carbon taxes in place and starting to deal with fossil fuels, but we actually have to go backwards with the problem and start to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere in different kinds of ways, negative emissions as you've described it. What are your thoughts on the best strategies to deal with negative emissions, you know, carbon sequestration, natural forms, but also you talked about the Enlightenment. We've got a whole series of research programs around geoengineering that are going to fundamentally challenge our entire thought process around ourselves and our relationship with the environment if we start to modify the geological epoch of this planet in that kind of way. And Harvard is actually a center of it. David Keith is there. I haven't been to Boston ever before. This stuff is happening, and they just had a huge meeting. And Trump in power, there's no global regulations around geoengineering right now. What are your thoughts on that mechanical intervention in the climate system and how we address that in this negative emissions context?
The question is about the fact that in our paper, Young People's Burden, we show that if we want to stabilize climate and avoid large sea level rise, that we're going to have to suck some CO2 out of the atmosphere. And it's possible to do that to a degree with processes that are quasi-natural by improving agricultural and forestry practices and reforesting marginal lands. We can draw a substantial amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if we had started a decade ago in putting a price on carbon, then that would probably have been enough. But we're now at a point where even a pretty optimistic assumption that we might be able to get 100 gigatons of carbon out by these agricultural and forestry things would still leave us at least 50 gigatons that we've got to get some other way. And that itself is, I guess, a geoengineering, sucking things, CO2 out of the atmosphere. But if we want to minimize that, we have to get on this downward track on fossil fuel emissions as quickly as possible. If we don't, we are likely to end up in a situation where suddenly the public will understand what's happening as we see ice sheets begin to discharge ice more rapidly. Then, and as people realize, oh, we will lose coastal cities if we don't do something, then this will increase the pressure for the kind of action that David Keith and some others are proposing. It goes all the way back to Budico 50 years ago, proposed human volcano. You know, the same sulfuric acid that we see on Venus causing this haze on Venus is the stratospheric aerosols we get when a volcano injects sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Well, we had this nice experiment in 1991 when Pinatubo, the biggest volcano in the last century, put enough aerosols in the stratosphere to cool the planet about 0.3 of a degree Celsius for 1 or 2 years. But also, if you look on Greenland, the least melt during the period of satellite observations of melting on Greenland was the year following Pinatubo, because the sunlight rays go through these aerosols at a slant angle for these high latitudes like Greenland and Antarctica. So it is effective in reducing the melt on these ice sheets. So humanity may end up in a situation where it realizes, oh, the only way we can save our coastal cities is by means of such geoengineering. And this is going to be a difficult decision for people to face. So to minimize the likelihood of that, or the magnitude of the problem as it will occur, we need to phase out emissions as soon as possible. But surely this discussion is going to get more and more publicity, and as we see the climate changes getting larger, it will become and that will be a big ethical issue which we'll need to face, and which young people in particular are the ones who will face the consequences and will need to make the decision, to help make the decision.
I'd like to expand on that. Just the cheapest thing to do is sulfur dioxide, right? Add sulfur dioxide. It would not cost very much money, and it could decrease rates of warming. It does absolutely nothing in terms of ocean acidification, because you're still producing the CO2. You're still facing ocean acidification. And as Ted Parsons has pointed out in an article a couple years back in Science, if you stop doing that, the rate of relaxation, in other words, the rate of temperature increase, if you were to stop doing it, would be catastrophic. There's very, very dangerous things that we could be backing ourselves into. Go ahead, sir.
Michael Knoll, Boston State University. I would like to actually combine a couple of things. On one hand, I would like to address the Council of the AAG, complimenting you on embracing the idea of divestment, and also to say from experience, because I'm a member of the steering committee of the Faculty and Staff Divestment Network, that depending on who you talk to, the analysts that work for your portfolios will not necessarily look in the right corners at times. And I've seen it in institutions like at Unity College in Maine, as well as we're working on this at Brevard College in North Carolina. There are ways for divestment that are possible. It is not as easy as it sounds, granted, but I'd like us to not be as reluctant, because time is a matter of high importance for us. But I also would like to point at this, the point that we can all actually make a difference too. We talked about the importance of public intellectualism yesterday. The possibility that we can work at a grassroots level, because working with Washington, D.C. these days has got to be more than just frustrating. But you have possibilities at the grassroots level to change your communities. Give you an example. In our community, biomass incinerator was planned. We stopped it. Now in place we have essentially a solar power plant. At the grassroots level, you can do much more perhaps than you can do at the national level, although we have to take a multi-pronged approach. Last thing, and I'm sorry for doing this, but I always do this like our wonderful guest does. Thank you for coming. One thing I wanted to ask about is the following. It seems that we haven't really talked about energy conservation. Yes, we need energy, but we also need to do something about wasting energy. We're doing not a very good job. And secondly, I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of both solar as well as wind power, in terms of its potentials, as it seems to be exploited or developed in certain European nations with more or less mixed results, but going in the right direction.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things there. The one was about conservation, and of course that is the single best contributor to solving the problem, because it is the one that doesn't have any negative consequences. Solar panels, windmills, they all have environmental impacts. Conservation is key. And I should point out that a carbon fee encourages conservation. The quickest way you can reduce your carbon footprint and make money in this fee and dividend approach is conservation. And the studies, economic studies, show that that's a major contributor to why emissions go down 30% within the first 10 years. So the way you encourage that is use the marketplace. So the second thing, with regard to renewables. And by the way, I'm all for renewables. My barn roof is covered with solar panels, and we generate twice as much electricity as we use. So renewables are a major part of the solution. They do suffer the practical difficulty that they're intermittent, and that's what Germany is struggling with now in trying to reduce its emissions. And in fact, they're not doing very well in terms of reducing their carbon emissions. But so people are trying hard to develop energy storage to make the renewables work. And Elon Musk, again, it's where we've encouraged our best entrepreneurs to contribute to this. And that's why I say it's too bad we're not also doing that with nuclear power. But in any case, he has developed this batteries, and it's provided to this one district in California a bank of these batteries, which will deal with the 4-hour, it'll give you 4-hour storage. So it deals with the daily so-called duck curve of the energy demand. But the real issue with renewables is not the daily intermittency. It's the week, 2-week, 3-week variability because of wind variability being highly dependent on the meteorology, and also the seasonal variation of solar intensity, for example. And going from going from batteries capable of storing 4 hours to a few weeks is enormous increase, and the batteries are not environmentally benign. So it's all a matter of competition. We need to let these go, and the winners will be different in different places. So all that competition would be encouraged and would occur quite rapidly. And we have, and despite my criticisms of the way our politics has deteriorated over the last 50 years, we still have the best potential in the world for innovations if we would just provide the incentive for that via a rising carbon price.